What's up, everybody? Welcome to the May 10th, 2024 episode of Why Am I Like This in the Broom Radio. Thank you for listening in live. Thank you for joining us asynchronously. I'm going to say that my guarantee for this container is that contexts will be disenmeshed, contexts will not be enmeshed, and I will hold space for good faith offerings of refinement relating to this guarantee and to the container in general. Why Am I Like This is a series that we hold space for in the Broom Radio. And I would say it's also I'd say all of the recordings that make it to the Broom Radio podcast. It's a live session, which I think is part of what makes it like radio and not just a podcast. And I would say that in this series of containers or episodes, we are recording, I'm just going to say containers of space-time. And I would say that when people listen to the recordings, they are offering space-time to the containers of space-time that are recorded in these episodes and in this series and on this podcast. I would say that the people who are here live are offering their space-time to the containers of these recordings, which we call episodes in this series of containers. And then I'll also say that we offer the space-times that we connect with when we're channeling offerings into our individual space-times, aka our bodies, which we are then physically articulating as offerings to these containers of space-time. And I would say that the articulations that we offer to this container of space-time I'd say that they're like the physical artifacts of metaphysical connections between space-time. I'll say that to illustrate the point a little further, I'll say that Discord is the server where the Broom Radio sessions take place. And this is also a nexus or a hub of connections between space-times because it's on the internet. And on the internet, we have little packets of data flying across fiber optic connections and Wi-Fi connections, which facilitate the connection of space-time in text and in voice. But I would say that these are all physical connections and data packets that represent our voices and our thoughts in text are also physical artifacts which go across these physical connections. Whereas I would say that the so-called data packets, or what I sometimes call terma, or what we sometimes call terma, or what other people have often, well, have many times across a lot of periods of time called terma. I would say terma are the metaphysical artifacts that are transmitted via metaphysical connections between, I'll say, space-time, within the fabric of space and time that we call our timeline on Earth, but also between the space-time of Earth and other planets and star systems and galaxies. And I'll say, yeah, like basically the physical articulations of these metaphysical articulations across metaphysical connections are pulled via the Discord server that we call the Broom. And then a very helpful robot named Craig records the physical articulations of the metaphysical artifacts. And we end up with episodes. And I can't say that I know for sure why I'm going to the lengths that I've gone to in order to describe all of this, but I will say that the metaphysical connection that I tend to invoke when I'm in these containers is a connection to my soul complex, which I know as, I tend to like describe as the astral body of the celestial body known as Sirius C from the Sirius star system, which I often call Red Star Green Cloud or Onobu the Elder. And I feel like other people who join live are also invoking metaphysical connections to different star systems, different planets, different, I'll say, like reserves of space time that come from our own planet. I guess, like, before I jump into the question, while I'm preparing my connection, I'll say also that Why Am I Like This is a session where I hold space for offerings of questions that usually come from within the broom, but often come from outside the broom, which are often posed to me or posed to the collective. And then I usually ask people if they can bring them in, if I can bring them into this container, if they can bring them into this container, so that we can invoke these metaphysical connections, so that we can make physical articulations, aka responses to these questions, so that well, I'll say that, like, for me, primarily these responses are a mirror that I can use to peer at reality. And it strikes me in this moment that the word peer is a homophone, because in the sense that I was using it, I was referring to like looking at something or inspecting something. And, the same word with the same spelling also relates to like different individuals who may be considered as part of the same category of individual. Like people who work in an organization at the same level might also be called peers. So I'm curious if any of my peers in this container would like to talk about the star systems or the metaphysical connections they feel they're invoking when they make offerings to this container. Lexi says Aldebaran. Hoda says, oh yeah. Anna says, oh yeah. Cassiopeia. We have Cassiopeia in the chat. Probably not the I would say, would you say, actually, I'm going to ask, do you feel like you're channeling the myth of Cassiopeia, who, from my recollection, is a queen of Ethiopia, right? No, no. That's what I thought. I feel like yeah. I was going to say, I feel like you're constellating the constellation, but I feel like you're constellating the channel that relates to the constellation. You're channeling the constellation. Or maybe some of the star beings who appear in that constellation, or asterism. The brightest star is named Shedar, it's Alpha Cassiopeia. I'm also assuming you're not channeling the USS Cassiopeia, which was a United States Navy crater-class cargo ship. Or the champion in the League of Legends. But I'm gonna say that my sense is like, yeah, you're invoking metaphysical connections to the stars, right? I feel three beings currently circling in. That's interesting. Well, I'm gonna hold space in case you want to share more about that. That's very interesting to me. There's some very luminous stars in Cassiopeia. Well, I'm going to read the question, which actually comes from Hoda, aka Intrepid Bodies. The question is, what would you say is the connection between Isis, um, I'm going to say Hitler, or Hathor, and Sekhem? Or, yeah, I'll just say Sekhem. And I feel like I've talked about Sekhmet before on previous episodes of Why Am I Like This, which I actually uploaded, which is not true of many episodes of Why Am I Like This, which I'm kind of keeping in the vault for unknown reasons. But there is a transmission on Sekhmet currently on the Broom Radio podcast. And I would say that Sekhmet. So I feel like the first thing to talk about is like the symbols, which are kind of like designated to represent sounds, which we usually call hieroglyphs, right? Or hieroglyphs. And the way, so I've made the sound Sekhmet, and I've made the sound Sekhem, and I've made the sound Hitr. And there's a lot of speculation about how these sounds used to be made compared to how we make them now, right? And I would say that I'm invoking something like those sounds when I say things like Hitr, Hitr. Because hieroglyphs are essentially an abjad, so they don't tend to denote vowel sounds, and the consonants are represented by hieroglyphs, which represent mostly, I say, objects, like physical forms that were referred to using certain sounds. So an example of this in like modern day, I'll say syllabaries or alphabets. But I don't think there are many alphabets that do this. But say in hiragana, which is a Japanese syllabary, you have symbols which represent syllables, which are usually like highly streamlined versions of so-called Chinese characters, which were what I call like ideograms, which represented mostly physical forms. And there's a lot of translation there because the Chinese writing system was kind of adopted or imposed by Chinese people upon Japanese people, loosely referring to those different like nationalities of people, even though I don't feel like the divisions between those people on a lineage level are very clean. But hopefully that illustrates the way that symbols can relate to sounds via depictions of physical objects that were gestured at via those sounds, and why we might have like quite some drift in the way that we pronounce the names of, let's say, Isis, or, my understanding is that in the time of ancient Egypt, she was referred to as Ist. And we have like Hetre here, which I think refers to Hetre, or Heru, or Hetre. And then Sekhem is referred to as Sechem. And my understanding is that the people of late Egypt did not really sound vowels very much. And what's coming to mind now is that like breath was kind of not to be wasted. Like breath was kind of sacred. And I feel like there are lineages which refer to spirit using, I'll say, like the representation of breath, like Rua. But I feel like most of us can probably understand how like it takes energy to speak, right? Like I'm using energy now to make these sounds. Let's say like if we're speaking to a lot of people, even if we're not speaking very loudly, like say if our voice or the sounds we're making with our voice are, I'll say, artificially amplified using electricity, it's often very draining. But of course, if people have to like speak to a lot of people in a large space in an unamplified way, that takes probably, you could say, more energy coming from the body in a measurable way. But then I would say when it comes to metaphysical energy, it takes probably roughly the same amount of energy. And I'd also say that like people who are speaking to a lot of people in large spaces in an unamplified way also receive probably a lot more energy from the people who are listening versus when their voices are captured and then amplified artificially using electricity. Is this making sense for y'all? I'm kind of curious if y'all have anything to offer on this topic before I actually talk about the connection between I'll just say Isis and Hathor and Sekhem. I'm mostly talking about the foundation, I'll say, of like these sounds, and not yet about what these sounds gesture at and how they're connected. And I'm also very curious, like, as to why. I guess I'll refer back to things I've said before on why am I like this, and also in the room, and probably on social media in different places, but not necessarily in what I would call a dispositive way. But I'll also refer to discussions that we've had on episodes on this podcast, relating to the exegesis of a book called The Mysticism of Sound and Music by Hazrat Inayat Khan. And I feel like the text itself gestures like fairly vaguely at what we, I think, articulated in more detail during the exegesis sessions, which are episodes of a series on the Broom Radio podcast called Sharia Way Book Club, which I'm looking forward to resuming. But I'm also looking forward to it with a lot of patience, because I feel like the codes that we require in order to continue producing episodes in that series are still gestating for good reason. But I'll say that what I'm trying to get at here is that for me, and I feel like probably for many people in the room, the sounds are primordial to the conceptualized, I'll say even anthropomorphized deities. Or you could say like deities are often anthropomorphized conceptualizations of energies. And I would say that those energies started out as sounds. And I feel like what might come up in relation to like what I'm saying for a lot of people is like, how can you say that like Isis is a sound? Like it feels like such a small thing, right? Like I'm making so many sounds now. Am I just like making gods? There is a willy wagtail on my balcony. Actually, I think it might be a honey eater. That's so beautiful. I usually get willy wagtails when I'm saying things which feel significant. But this one's a honey eater, so it's got a more curved, longer beak and little yellow splotches on its rear wings, or at the ends of its wings. Oh no, it's a loud truck. I'm gonna close the door. And it's saying, just in case y'all forgot, the man is Australian. Willy wagtail is an Australian name for a bird, which I feel like is more popular in like Malaya, Melanesia, like Southeast Asia. We ain't got those around these here parts. In case y'all forgot, the man's also American. I'm an American citizen. Anyway, since I'm digressing already, I want to get back to what I was saying about sounds being primordial to deities and how that might be a bit strange to a lot of people. But I want to say that Lexi said, I can share that before I started healing, speaking was really exhausting for me, which I feel like aligns with what I was saying about the energy it takes to speak. But going back, what's up, Omachi? I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly because you gave us a little bit of a schooling on that, Omachi. But going back to what I was saying about sounds as being primordial to deities, I guess I'll reference something that comes up in many lineages, including the lineages that are articulated by Hazrat Eniyak Khan in the Mysticism and the Sound of Music, including Abrahamic lineages, when, basically it was said that God said, let there be light, and then light occurred. And I feel like this also relates to things that we've talked about regarding terma. With regard to terma being realms of space-time, which are, I'll say, contained, and then I'll say primed or initiated by sound or vibration. In the same sense, to be honest, that, I'll say that like AIs are primed by the data that they're trained with and the questions that we give to them. You could say that we're articulating something into the container of the AI, and then the AI is like doing some stuff and then producing an output. And I would say that the same thing happens with Earth. You could say that Earth was conditioned by vibrations, aka sounds, from outside of the realm of Earth. And then you could also say that Earth is providing an output constantly. Providing reflections of electromagnetic energy, which are processed in certain ways, turned into different organisms, which become fuels, which are burnt, which often end up being used to produce electricity so we can electrically amplify people's voices, which is then producing vibrations which can then be considered as a response to the vibrations which are used to condition Earth from, let's just say, to be simple, the rest of the rest of the complex, I was about to say, but the rest of the cosmos. Homachi says, I wasn't paying attention. Did I just hear my name? I mean, that's kind of my question. Did you hear your name? Am I pronouncing your name properly? AKA, hello. Um, so, if you thought that when I said that sounds are primordial or vaster than deities, and you felt affronted by that because sounds seem insignificant, and the sounds that I'm making seem insignificant, especially since I'm making so many of them, then perhaps what I just said makes you feel a little less affronted. But if not, I will continue. Homachi says, shit, that's nearly correct. Thanks. I'll take that. I'll take that for now. I definitely want to hold space for corrections, but not necessarily in audio because I feel like um, I want to try and respond to this question comprehensively in the time that I have. But yeah, so to summarize what I said before, our realm or terma are conditioned by sounds or vibrations. And I would say that the sounds which we make when we say things like Isis or Est or Hathor or Hetere or Sechem or are on some level some of the sounds that condition Earth. And when we make the sounds at our level of reality within the space time of Earth, then you could say we're almost like echoing those sounds. Or like you could say like invoking the energies that we use to condition Earth when those sounds were made. Almost like tiny little echoes of those sounds. And I would say that those sounds, of course, are like not a carbon copy, so to speak. I'm kind of saying that tongue in cheek because they do come from bodies which are built upon a carbon substrate, right? Like most of the life forms within Earth. They don't sound exactly the same as the sounds that we use to condition Earth, because I would say that the sounds that we use to condition Earth are gestured at by the sounds that I'm making when I say things like hetero. But those sounds are happening on much vaster levels. So you could say that like the sounds that I'm making are kind of like slightly distorted wavelets which resemble the vaster waves that represent the sounds that we use to condition our realm. So I'm going to like invoke a few different metaphors to add further color to what I'm saying, but I'll say that if you could imagine that the song of the universe was a piece of music played by a symphony orchestra, then you could either imagine that hetere or est or sechem represented different chunks of this song. But I would say it's more accurate to talk about hetere and sechem or este as different parts played on different instruments which are part of this symphonic orchestra. And I would say that those parts are also not the entire part of any one instrument in that orchestra. So you could say that I hope I'm getting a little closer to answering the question. Um, I feel like Hoda probably already knows where I'm going, and Anna's feeling stuff in her ankles, so you probably have a sense as well, especially since I know that you have some grounding in music theory. But let's say, like in this metaphor, this symphony orchestra has like a rhythm section, and that rhythm section includes, I'll say, like maracas and timpanis and triangles and maybe somebody on cymbals. And then I would say that, of course, like all of those instruments have different parts, but let's say they're maybe played by three different people in this metaphor, and sometimes they're played together, right? So I would not say that Isis, let's say, I'm just going to say it because it's easier to hear nowadays when I say Isis with the voices that we have today, which, I think refers to what I would call, or yeah, sometimes people say Astat. And I feel like this is very synchronized because another member and tender of the pot slash the broom linked to a TikTok video recently, which was trying to like weave together different threads relating to these energies, like Astarte, Aphrodite, Isis. What's kind of, I'd say, like I'm hearing hermaphrodite as a word, right? As a portmanteau of like Hermes and Aphrodite. Um, but yeah, I'll say that like none of, I'll say, the goddesses that Hoda referred to in the question are either that whole section or that whole section playing for the whole song. And I'd also say that like in typical like orchestral pieces, the percussion or rhythm section tends to come in and out fairly infrequently, which I think y'all can probably connect to the experience of goddess reverence on Earth, right? Like at various times in history, goddesses were worshipped. I'd say almost never exclusively, but then I would say like for the past say 3,500-ish years, we've sort of been like declining in our reverence of goddesses in, I'll say, most cultures. Um, and you can imagine that in a symphonic composition, that might be represented by like a period of steady playing from the percussion section of the orchestra, which gets slower and maybe quieter as the rest of the orchestra plays. I'm just going to like hold space there to see if anybody has any questions or any other offerings or complaints. Wait for my boy, the honey eater, come back. So I feel like I'll continue metaphorically, if you will allow me. But I'll say it in this metaphor. I'll say that like Isis. I'm just going to say Isis is perhaps crudely a segment of that composition which incorporates the triangle and the symbol, and I'm going to say that's it for now. And I'll say that that is fairly, I'm going to say, if the composition's like 1 hour long, which is a long composition compared to the songs that we tend to hear nowadays in popular culture, which tend to be around like 3 to 7 minutes, let's say. Let's say this composition's an hour. I'll say that the triangle and the symbol were playing from about minute 21 to minute 28. And then I'll say that hetera is a part of the composition which includes the timpani and the maracas around minutes 20. I'm just going to say 20 to around 24 to 25. And then I'll say that sechem is mostly like the timpani, the maracas, and the cymbal. And I'll say that they're being played for the whole composition. And then I feel like from that framework, you can probably see how hetera could be considered like just one segment of the entire part played by sechem, or in the entire part which I've referred to as sechem. And I'll say that there are different players of those instruments, but I'm just talking about parts right now, which represent sounds which end up conditioning our realm, which I'll say within the time of Earth, within those times, within the space-time of Earth, end up being mostly conceptualized anthropomorphically as sechem and hetera and as. Well, I wasn't talking about as. But you can also see perhaps how parts of Isis are woven into the part of Sekhem and Hetera. I'll say in my framework, the parts of Isis and Hetera are distinct, but they're both woven into the part of Sekhem, or could be said to be parts of the part of Sekhem. And like all of those parts are played by multiple instruments, right? Which suggests that that way that we've conceptualized or anthropomorphized those parts or those energies or those sounds sort of conflates what could be called more fundamental energies which compose those sounds, which I'm calling triangle, maraca, cymbals, and timpani. Which is not to say that like we shouldn't revere those deities, because they all, I'd say, like gesture at in some way towards real parts in this orchestration. It's not like we're necessarily like ignoring. Well, I wouldn't say that we're ignoring reality. I'd say that like in the way that we conceptualize these deities, we are choosing to give reverence to certain parts of the composition and not giving reverence, or not necessarily avoiding or ignoring the other parts, but that in those times it occurred to humans who were channeling those sounds or experiencing manifestations of those sounds within the earth realm to give reverence to those particular parts of the orchestra. So you can imagine like in the audience people being like, oh, like I really like that part, or like that part's really doing something for me, or that part's really showing up in my life right now. I would say that like if we exclusively give reverence to any of those deities which are conceptualized and anthropomorphized versions that represent the some of the sounds in that composition, then we may ignore other parts of that composition. And I would say that probably like the most, pun intended, instrumental part of the framework I'm laying out is that as those parts, or you could say like the parts that the instruments play within the composition change, if we're, I'll say, overly fixated on particular parts of the composition, then we may find it hard to understand how those instruments are playing different parts. So, like, you could imagine that, like, if you're so enthused by the part of the timpani and the cymbals at, say, like minute 23, then when the timpanis and the cymbals are playing at minute 30, you might not remember what they played. You might not give reverence to what was played at minute 30. And in case you're not necessarily following along with how this metaphor correlates to like reality, you could say that in many ways, I would say humans have become fixated on the conceptualized and anthropomorphized representations of Isis, and to a lesser extent Hathor, and to a lesser extent Sekhmet, such that we almost as a species, or you could say as like a few different civilizations, give almost no reverence to the parts that those instruments and the instrumentalists are playing in minute 30, which is to say that like we're not really listening. I'm just seeing exclamation marks in the chat. So Anna's saying, I feel like it can be applied to many days. I agree, right? But I would say also that like deities, again, are just representations of the parts, right? So you can imagine that like in the realm of Earth, we may not give reference explicitly, say, to like, I'm going to say Arwen. But for me, Arwen was a non-anthropomorphized and like I'll say like very lightly conceptualized representation almost of the entire composition. Like maybe the entire orchestra except for the conductor. And like even if we don't necessarily refer to Arwen by name very often in common time. I know in the Broom we talk about Arwen quite often. We are giving reverence to other aspects of that composition by different names, like the internet or like science, right? Which you could say like, well, science is like a name that we give to the part that's played by the bugle and the flute and the clarinet and the bassoon. And yeah, I'm gonna say like the violin and the viola and the piccolo between say like minutes 29 and 30. But yeah, like some of those instruments are also playing fairly constantly throughout the rest of the composition, and we might refer to them by different names. Just like scrying the container to see if there's anything else to like give a shade to that's coming up for me, but I'm also holding space. Hod, if you want to share that tweet, definitely hold space for that. Oh, it's a tweet from Cushion Flax Seeds. And I'm not going to talk about how the deity of Cushion Flax Seeds relates to the deity of Intrepid Bodies in this container. But Cushion Flax Seed says, ever experience energy work that feels like conducting a choir of 1,000 flutes and violins? Wow. Yeah, that's hilariously on point. No, that came out in November of 2023, so about 5, 6-ish months ago, 5 to 6 months ago, and I feel like that's really aligned. Um, I feel like I want to kind of edify, yeah, edify what I'm saying in this metaphor by giving some shade to like some of the more concrete characteristics of the deities that we invoke when we say Isis West and Hetere and Sekhmet and how they relate and how this relates to the metaphor of like the triangle, the cymbals, the maracas, and the timpani. And say that, yeah, like I guess the characteristics that I'll name in this container, which for me relate to Isis, and some of the deities which are also, I'd say, related to aspects of that part mostly, like Aphrodite. Neptune's coming to mind, which is kind of funny to me because I would say like Neptune kind of relates to a particular way of listening to some of that part, and then other parts played by very similar instrumentalists on the same instruments. So I guess I'm also gesturing at a rotating cast of instrumentalists who play the instruments. But yeah, like some of those characteristics for me are like fertility, I'll say. Um, I'll say shielding, I'll say judgment or assessment. Um, I'll say discernment. And then I'll also say self reverence or self worship. And then I'll say, using some of the same terms, that for me, the deity that we refer to as Hathor or Heter represents, like, I'll say, assessment and self loving as opposed to like self worship. And then I'll add some characteristics like passion and I'm also holding space if y'all want to like shout out the characteristics of these deities. Um, I'm going to say vitality rather than fertility. And then some of the characteristics that I associate with Sekhem, or I'll say some of the characteristics I associate with Sekhmet, which I feel like are some of the characteristics of Sekhem. I'll describe as judgment, assessment, passion, and vitality, which come from the previous set of characteristics that I used to describe Isis and Hathor. And then I'll add fury, and I'll add I'm reaching deep into like my bag of vocabulary. I will say conviction. And then the characteristics of Sekhem that I'm going to name, which come out of the previous grab bags of characteristics that I've named in relation to Isis and Hathor and Sekhmet, are vitality and something related to conviction, but I'm going to call it resolution. Oh, this says more grunts affirmatively. So I feel like I've kind of offered a few different ways of thinking about how these anthropomorphized, mostly conceptualizations of these energies can be related within the realms of what I'll call like personality characteristics. One, two, music, and then three, with regard to like the metaphysics of the cosmos. And is asking resolution like being resolute or resolving conflict. I would say that they use the same etymons. I don't really see them as being like fundamentally different. I would say that like egregorically, being resolute is often seen as being distinct from resolving conflict. But I feel like being resolute is often etymologically essential for resolving conflict. I'll just say that like being resolute is often egregorically associated with being intransigent. Whereas I can imagine, I'll say like egregorically, you can imagine someone being described as resolute if they, quote, stick to their guns, unquote. But I could also say that, like, in a sense that is truer to the etymological sense of like resolution or being resolute, I would say that being resolute could be described as holding space or remaining grounded. And I would say that the latter is probably more easily associated with how we think about resolving conflict and conflict resolution. And I feel like in this little example of like how words can like sort of, I would say like the meaning can evolve and also kind of become a little unclear as they tend to, I'd say like enter collective consciousness and are used for communication between separate beings in different contexts. Often, when space is not being held very effectively, then these words end up picking up different meanings, which could be seen to be expansive but also distortive of like the etymons from which they're composed. And I would say like that's an example also of what can happen with fixation and worship when it comes to conceptualizations of energies, which again I'll just like reiterate can often cause us to miss what those instruments are doing later on in the composition, or even like who's playing those instruments, right? Because I sort of referred to this like rotating cast of players in the orchestra. Maybe some of the same players switching instruments, swapping them. Maybe like players who like weren't playing those instruments or any of the instruments coming on to pick up some of those instruments to give some of the other players a rest, which I think like if you're sharp, you can probably relate to things I've talked about regarding soul swapping or the cultivation of cosmic chakras by different cosmic bodies or different soul complexes. But I feel like that's not an essential part of understanding my response to this question. But it's just like a little extra stuff there if you want to tune into that. Yeah, I guess I'm just going to hold space to see if y'all have any reflections or any clarifiers or any clarifying offerings, questions. Any more tweets from accounts that may or may not be, or you could say like instruments that may or may not be played by instrumentalists who also play other instruments who are currently in this container. Or deities. that are cultivated by any players in the orchestra who are currently present in this container. What is saying purr? From Cassiopeia. Cassiopeia is saying purr through Hoda. And yeah, I guess like with that, I'll kind of like offer that you might find different ways of expressing yourself if you consider your body to be an instrument in a grand orchestration, which is playing along with the orchestra that I would say like constitutes the sounds that are coming from outside of Earth into Earth to condition Earth. Which is to say, like, you might express yourself differently if you consider, like, quote, channeling, unquote, and shielding the song of the universe in different ways. If you consider your vessel as just one instrument in the orchestra on Earth, sort of playing along with the orchestra from the cosmos. And I'll say, like, with that, I feel pretty complete, and I'm going to start closing up my channel. And I'll say thank you for tuning in to Why Am I Like This on the Broom Radio. Even if you're listening in asynchronously via the Broom Radio podcast, I'll say if you want to support me, you can hit up any of the, or you can hit up buymeacoffee.com/Nobu for Jimmy-chan. And the link will be in the description of this episode when it eventually makes it to the podcast. And the Buy Me a Coffee of the Broom Radio, which you can support at buymeacoffee.com/the Broom Radio. And you could support any of these, I'll say, entities, either on a one-off basis, or you can sign up to become members of the membership programs that are offered by me at buymeacoffee.com/Jimmy-chan/membership, or the membership tier, which is offered by the Broom Radio to a specific part of the Broom Radio for members only, which we call the pot. And you can support that at buymeacoffee.com/the Broom Radio/membership. And if you would like to, I'll say, play a part in the part of the composition of the Song of Earth that we are playing in the Broom Radio, aka if you would like to join these sessions live, then you can join the Broom Radio Discord and join us when we're recording these episodes, aka holding these containers. And you should be able to find a link in the description of this episode, again, when it eventually makes it to the podcast and or the I'll say like buymeacoffee.com email lists. And with that, I'll say thank you once again for joining me live and or listening asynchronously. I consider all offerings of space-time to this container to be part of this container, even if they are happening, quote, after, unquote, this container is recorded. And I hope to see you soon. Peace. I forgot I have to type stuff. Peace.